All right. All right. Well, Nick, Anthony, thank you very much for allowing me to be here for PhillyXP. This has been a long time coming, definitely. So I think I know everybody here, actually. I've got a lot of old friends, which is fun. So I think all of you know me already. My name is Dustin Thostenson. I'm based out of the Des Moines area, Des Moines, Iowa. And conversation today is techniques to tackle tech debt today. Basic concept of this is as we've gone around, I think all of us have seen that this is a real major issue for most of the teams that we run up against. So we're going to cover a bunch of different areas on things that we can do so people can hopefully go back tomorrow or maybe on Monday because, who wants to do that much on a Friday? And maybe find some different approaches to solve problems that have been around for way too long. All right, so I've got a shocking opener here. We've lived in this house for about 5 years now, and I noticed when we moved here, I was walking into rooms and I was kind of dumbfounded because the lights didn't go on. Our previous house we were at for I think 11 years, and I'm a developer, so I'm lazy. So I got used to things turning on and off when they should. And when I would walk into my closet and the lights didn't come on, it would take me a moment before I realized, oh yeah, I have to turn the light on. And then when I would come back a few hours later, I would remind myself, oh yeah, I have to turn the light off. So I started putting in a lot of switches, room sensing switches. Turn on when you get in there, turn off when you get out. And if anybody's ever done electrical work before, you've probably learned it's not really that hard. You just got to take a couple of screws, pop the plate, couple more screws to get the fixture out. And then there's a ground wire and a couple other screws in there. I'm not sure what those wires are for, but if you undo them, you can plug in a new outlet and it's pretty easy to do. But the problem that I was facing is my uh, fuse box is all the way out into the garage. And that was like 35 steps. So every time I would run out in the garage, turn it off, come into the room, swap out a fixture, go back, turn it on, come back, see if there's any smoke, see if the lights work. And after doing that a few times, I realized, that's just a lot of extra work. As long as you take the wires and you kind of bend them the right way, you don't really need to turn the fuse off. And I had electrocuted myself at least a dozen times in the matter of a couple of weeks because every time I thought I had it just perfect, I'd make just a silly mistake. I would, you know, look on one side and move my hand to the other side and blow the fuse, give myself a good old shock. Or there'd be a little bit of spring in a wire. So when you're pulling it out, it would bounce and it would hit something. It would short out, you get a big shock. And I shocked myself a lot, a lot. And I don't think that this is going to come to a big surprise to anybody that knows me. This might actually be a little light bulb moment where, oh, that makes sense. But while doing that, I realized, it's one thing for me to choose to be an idiot. But when I had somebody come over and do actual work, I wasn't going to ask them to shave a couple of seconds and not go off and turn the breakers off. I realized that professionals are hired to act like professionals. Now, my friend who did some electrical work kind of laughed and smiled and said, yeah, sometimes he doesn't turn the breaker off either, and occasionally he'll shock himself, but that's his choice. He is a professional who knows what he's doing and he knows the risks that he's taking. I think that a lot of software developers earn on par what many other professionals out there do, electricians and such. However, there's this weird belief that other people can tell us how to do our jobs. We've learned a lot of things on how to do things well. We're at user groups, we read books, we talk with other professionals. Software development is a relatively new industry. but we've already learned how to act like professionals, just like accountants do double entry bookkeeping, just like doctors wash their hands in between patients. These are just common things that we do. However, oftentimes that's not really the case. We're being told, hurry up, cut corners, and then we have to live with those results. So I like to kind of set that as an expectation because sometimes people look past that and they think that somebody else can tell them how to do their job. And the truth is, as software developers, we're professionals. We're being paid to act like professionals. And that's really something that we need to kind of carry through on a daily basis. The reason I bring this up is the real problem statement of our of this session here. And this is something that we've seen over and over and over. Tech debt is slowing down teams' abilities to deliver. They find themselves cutting corners a lot of times in order to have short-term gains so they can meet a deadline. And the next time you go in there, we have these problems that just keep building and building and building. And from an overall happiness standpoint, from a joy of work perspective, this is one of the biggest things that I see developers and teams face. Once we start making these changes, we find out that that cost of change is just too damn high. So you can see in the picture here, that cost of change, the COC, optimally as a product gets older, you're going to see that things naturally get more complex. But if you have that debt, that cost continues to increase. And this red line reflects how, as that cost increases, our ability to satisfy our customers drops. And I've seen this in some pretty bad scenarios where teams have kept pushing off basic hygiene, basic refactoring, and they get to the point where they might hire professionals to come in and try to fix their teams because they realize the amount that we have to spend for software and the value that we're getting out of it is just way too high. And by the way, I know that I've got a lot of other really reputable professionals here. Stephen Baker is also here. If anybody wants to chime in at any point, please feel free.
I actually have that slide differently presented in one of my presentations, this slide, except for
Yeah?
that red line that decreases there. I think it showed something different, and I'm just curious what I had, so I'm looking at that.
Thanks, Mike. So the reason that I'm giving this talk is really not to acknowledge tech debt, but to really get to that point of what can you do, right? How are you able to do something about it? And I've seen this a lot. I've seen people complaining about it. Does anybody remember this scene of The Simpsons? It was kind of it was a flashback episode where Flanders had his kid who was, no, I think this actually was Flanders' parents, maybe even. Their kid was really hyper, and the parents were beatniks. And they said, we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. So if you're facing these types of problems and all you've done is complain about it, maybe there's some things that we can address here and maybe get some fresh ideas on what we could try. Wouldn't be a good talk if we don't have a quote from Jerry Weinberg. The first time I read this, it was so simple, it was easy to dismiss, as a lot of his insights are. But things are the way they are because they got that way. And it's not necessarily a statement of blame. It's just an acknowledgement that, we make a lot of decisions day to day, week to week, month to month that start to kind of pile up and get us to where we're at. And it's not that we have to go back and blame people for it or, try to point fingers. It's just an acknowledgement that that's how it is. But today we have a choice. We can try to do something about it. So what is it that we can do? This was integral model that I had learned about a couple of years ago. And it was kind of an interesting way to start framing some different concepts here, right? There are the lateral uh, scope is the interior versus exterior, the things that are, inside of people and outside the environment versus the person. And then from top to bottom, you have the individual and the collective concepts. So there may be a lot of different things that we can talk about that might help influence change. This is kind of a good framing for that. Once you start getting into the exterior collective side down the bottom right, there gets to be a lot of things that we may see in organizations that are very grandiose, and these are going to solve all the problems. But in the top left, these individual and interior things, these are things that individuals can have control over. That motivation of software craftsmanship, the focus on some of those agile, not the agile, not the big agile concept, but just those agile, responsive mindsets that we've learned. Coaching, things that people can do. So a lot of our talk is going to be kind of based on some of these things and then continuing to move outward. And here's something that I had learned when I was over at Industrial Logic from Matthew Carlson. I think that Esther Derby and Diana Larson were some of the first people to introduce this soups and circles concept. But the basic concept here is at the center of it, you have your circle of control. These are the things that you have control over yourself, decisions you can make, and you can kind of take control over and own your destiny. As you move outward, we're going to have that circle of influence, the things that are going to impact you, that you might be able to help influence how those things change so it can have a better impact on you. And then that circle of concern on the outside, those are things that you are concerned about, but you might not have a direct line to make changes in that area. I do have some links at the bottom of my slides. When we get to the end, I've got a QR code. So if you are trying to scribble these down, fear not. We'll be able to scan a QR code and you can kind of dive into some of the links if there's anything in here that you found helpful. But this framing I have found is very, very helpful. Skylar Watson has just released a book. I got it last weekend called Visualizing Empowerment. And he takes some of these concepts and builds off them a lot more. But for the purpose of this talk, you'll see that diagram as kind of a little cue as we move forward. So if you've got some ADHD tendencies and you start to kind of zone off and you kind of come in and out of this meeting, go ahead and just take a look for this diagram, and hopefully that will help set the current scope of the conversation that we're having. So starting off there, you see the little green dot here. Whoopsie. Little green dot. We're kind of talking about internal things that we can control ourselves here. I love this scene. Put that copy down. So I switched it up a little bit to always be cleaning instead of always be closing. So a lot of the stuff that we have here is kind of mindset. Some of the things that we could start focusing on a daily basis, and what should we be thinking about as we're moving forward with the changes we're making. And if you want to just keep copy and pasting code and, solving your problem today, think about that. Think about the ABCs here. Think about the things that you can do to actually make an improvement, because every person on the team does actually have that ability. I should update this to have my name here too, shouldn't I? Dustin Thostenson. This kind of builds off of that Flanders Simpsons quote as well, or that previous slide. I've seen a lot of people suffering from tech debt and doing absolutely nothing about it. We can give recommendations, we can give build up some training, and people are afraid to even try something. If you're running into a tech debt issue, if you have this problem in your organization, don't wait for it to be solved outside. See what you can do and try some things out. Frame it as an experiment. Say we're going to try some things and see what happens. I've learned that when you frame things as experiments, people are understanding that you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and maybe it's a little bit safer to make that change. And I think that a lot of people here are familiar with the responsibility process. This is something that I have learned about maybe 8 years ago. It's been continuing to build for me. I did go through Dr. Christopher Avery's cohort last year, spent about 6 months going through it, and it was a wonderful way to see yourself and to see the world and to be able to start recognizing that you do have abilities. If somebody is not familiar with the responsibility process, I'll give you a really quick overview. The way that I understand this is it's a lot like the stages of grief. I think we've all heard about that. When somebody dies, there's different stages that we go through: bargaining, denial, anger, etc. These are stages of thought that people will go through. So when something bad happens, the first thing is people will usually be in denial, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And what I mean by being in denial, the stories that you're going to tell in your head are going to confirm your belief that it's not really a problem. No, we're going to hit the deadline. We'll be fine. It's not an issue, right? You dismiss that a problem actually exists. When you find out that denial isn't working anymore and you're faced with the problem, let's say the deadline comes and goes and you didn't actually get it done, then you might start telling yourself stories of blame. All of the reasons that we didn't hit the deadline are outside of us. It's because the QA team took too long, or the DevOps team screwed something up, or we didn't get the right requirements. All the thoughts that you're thinking about are taking the power outside of you and leaving you to be the victim. We didn't get it because of all these other reasons out there. So those are all stories of blame. And this model is so powerful because now that I understand it, you can see it in other people very easily. And sometimes you can even see it in yourself. You can tell when you're telling yourself stories of blame. And the beauty of that acknowledgement is you can start changing how you approach it. The next level after blame is justify. Again, these are red because they're not necessarily good behaviors, but you can start telling yourself stories why it's okay that we missed the production deadline. That never happens here. We always go past our deadlines. We don't have the right tools. Again, you're all the reasons for where you're at are outside of you. The next level up is shame, which is kind of like an internal blame. You start taking ownership of how things are, but you might blame yourself for it. We missed a deadline because I wrote bad code, because I didn't know how to use React that well. I didn't know how Angular worked. I didn't know how to build the pipeline right. You have all these different reasons, and you start taking ownership, but you're making yourself feel really bad for it. Oftentimes, that might be where people leave. They'll kind of go to quit. They just opt out, and that's where they leave it. Obligation is where you're starting to do the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. You might feel obligated to work all night and all weekend so you can try to get the project back up to speed. You feel that you owe it to your teammates to do all of the work. So you're doing the right thing, but for the wrong reason. Crossing the line here for responsibility is that point where you acknowledge, I am in full control of the decisions I make today. I can acknowledge where things are. I don't need to blame other people. Where I'm at right now, I get to make a choice on where I would like to see things be. What is the future that I would like to see? And then you get to make decisions based on how you want to get there. If my wife tells me that we have to go to the opera or we have to go spend time at her mom's house, I could go and feel like I'm an obligation. I have to go to the opera with my mother-in-law, or I can make a choice. I can choose to go to the opera with my mother-in-law because I want to make them happy, or I can choose to stay home and watch basketball. It doesn't mean that the choices you make and responsibility are necessarily consequence free. But if you choose to sleep on the couch, that's your choice. Nobody else is making that for you. Yeah. Responsibility process is kind of a big thing. I think that a lot of the attendees here have seen that. Does anybody else want to add anything to it or any color commentary about how it's impacted their life? All right, so back to Glengarry Glen Ross. Uh, do I have your attention? Do I have your interest? Have you made a decision? This is the first major step. If you and your team are facing a lot of tech debt issues, you have to come to this point. You have to make a commitment to yourself that you're going to do something about it instead of just waiting for the world around you to magically improve. This isn't something that you can just hire outside. I know that that might be against some of the best interests for people in this room, but it is something that everybody needs to kind of take ownership for and start moving forward. So part of that, another one of the models I like here is this skill and will model. So this is kind of good for yourself. This is good for your team. Do you have the skill to do something? If you have high skill, but you don't really have a will, not much is going to happen. If you have really good skills and you have high wills, you're going to see a lot of great things here. But if you and your team might have high will, but low skill, that means that you're going to have to build up the skill. And if you don't have the high skill or will, nothing's going to happen. And I think we've all been in coaching engagements where we've been set to teams, which are hopefully going to make improvements, but we might find that not only do they have low will, but they might have low skill as well. And we can teach them the skill, but changing a person's will is extremely difficult. So if you find yourself in a hole, if you find that the code base that you're in is bad, quit digging. So the first thing is the concept of code smells. Those are the symptoms of poor design or implementation choices. So the reason that I bring up code smell is because if things are bad, you should be able to pick out why they're bad. Pop quiz. How many code smells can our audience here find?
Duplication.
Duplication. We got one.
I mean,
Any other code smells?
I use the Sparrow deck, so that's the first thing that popped out at me was duplication.
Perfect.
Long method.
Long method.
Nice.
Nobody said there was going to be a test, Dustin.
Switch
All right.
statement.
Yeah, I mean,
Which
it's Java,
statement?
but it's not using type safety at all. Everything is being cast. With instance of, which I will also consider a smell.
Yeah, I forget what the name of the smell is, but the code is avoiding taking advantage of the inheritance
Mm.
relationship by putting the code in the actual child classes.
All right. And I did steal this from Industrial Logic, and I do give them
Yeah.
credit.
Yeah, okay. I was gonna say that looked familiar.
Yeah. I really like this. I learned a lot myself just going through and turning the feelings of code into terms. Because once I can have a conversation with somebody and we can talk about refused bequest or inappropriate intimacy or long method, I mean, John and I had done that before where we would see the code and we would use these terms, and then it was a real quick shortcut. So it wasn't a feeling of bad code, but we had the terminology to speak to it. So I would say the first step, if your skill is a little bit low, continue to build up that vocabulary. Look at the code and be able to pick out what is wrong with it. What do we have that is duplicate? Where do we have alternative classes with different interfaces? Where can we put in a switch statement? If you can't identify why the code is bad, if you can't see it when it's bad, it's a lot harder to change it. So the first thing is if you see a code smell, pay attention to that trigger. That might be an opportunity for you to start slowing down and looking into it more. And again, I will have all of these references at the end of the presentation, but I found this quick reference guide to be very handy. There is a lot of items in there, but you should be able to look at the books, Refactoring to Patterns from Josh Karyevsky. He's got a lot of great ideas in there to say, here's the code smell, and here's what you refactor it to. Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, is another fabulous read that I think most developers at some point go through and they're thinking, wow. The beauty of this is Michael Feathers wrote the book because he knew a lot of these things. He wanted to write it so people would quit asking him questions, and the exact opposite happened. So I think he's had that book for about 20 years now, and he's still being invited to conferences to talk about it. So if you're seeing smells, identify them, figure out where to go with it. Temporal coupling is one smell that I have seen a lot of. And the basic concept is, you got loose coupling, high cohesion. So the concept that I think of cohesion is things that change together, stay together. And coupling has to do with how many different points they connect to each other. This bottom example is a pretty good example that I've seen repeatedly. And I think a lot of times it has to do with the concept of and then. When developers or business folks are talking about the code issue, they'll say, we got to do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then. And at each step of that way, they make those changes. Well, and then we call this API, and then we read this file in, and then we make this validator call. And you just keep going step by step to call out the places that you need, instead of kind of organizing it around a way where the things that should stay together change together. So temporal means time-based. So we will add code in because it just happens to happen at that time. But there are different ways to organize the code, so maybe you don't have to tie it in that tightly. There's a lot of different design patterns. And again, if you don't know them, that's fine. It's a good opportunity to go out and, keep learning things. Stop digging. Kent Beck talks about make the change easy and then make the easy change. So now we're kind of getting into that concept of refactoring. So if you're entering the code base and you see a lot of temporal coupling and then, what are the things that you can do to start changing that code around to reduce the tech debt in small places so it's easier to change and it's harder to make more tech debt happen? Probably one of the biggest things that has helped me is code katas. I know I don't pronounce it as well as Smothers. Katas is what some people say, but the idea is you go through these motions repeatedly. In martial arts, they will block and kick and punch, and you do those things so often that when you need to actually block, kick, or punch, it's muscle memory. You don't have to think about it. You can do that with a lot of different katas as well. Gilded Rose, Emily Beisch has got a Git repo I think I've got a reference for in here. But if you start doing these things for yourself, if you start making the code changes yourself frequently, doing small things, when you actually see the code, it becomes a lot easier to fix it. You don't have to think as much about it. When you see long method, you know how to extract parts of that method out into smaller methods. You just do it without thinking. I think sometimes the tech that people run into is they don't know how to fix it intuitively, so they have to spend a lot of cognitive time trying to figure out how to do that. So if you start building up your skills more, and if you start doing that as a team, nope, that wasn't there. Then you might be able to develop those habits a lot better. So you get that routine coming in where you see the trigger, the cue, and you know the routine, and you get that little dopamine hit where you say, all right, I did it. I extracted a method. I reduced the complexity, the cyclomatic complexity of the code by 1. Great. Nice little kicks. And I like this image from Fry. I don't know if I am a good programmer because I'm refactoring constantly or bad because I have to refactor constantly. But the truth is, I don't care. As long as I can do things quickly and as long as I can get some validation for my tests, I'll just keep doing it. The end result is usually nice. And it might be a little bit overwhelming. You might see a big ball of twine here and you might be able to get one area cleaned up, but sometimes people think it's too much and they'll still focus on the bad instead of focusing on the good. But just before this session started, I was working on some code and I needed to refactor it first. So I asked my buddy Brandon, what is the last class that you did with the Fluent validator? Because I want to reference that when I'm converting this other validator over to a Fluent validator. So you just keep giving some good examples and keep learning off of them. All right, so again, initial focus was on ourselves. What are the things that we could do? Recognize the problems, commit to doing something about it, build up your individual skills so when you have to fix the problems, you can do it much more quickly without a whole lot of effort. For the team, how do you start to expand that? Well, this is one of the fun areas, I think. People think that the product owners and scrum masters decide the team's backlog. They decide that the work that the team does. False. I lifted a couple of paragraphs here out of the Scrum Guide. I know that most teams are doing Agile, they're doing Scrum, and they've never read the Scrum Guide. But there's nothing in here that says the product owner and the Scrum Master decide what the teams do. The fact that you are giving up that power for somebody else to decide if you can turn that breaker off or not is incorrect. Fundamentally. Now, maybe people want to choose to do that because sometimes it's easier for somebody else to make a choice for them. I've thought about that Eurythmics song a lot. Sweet dreams are made of this. Or actually, we were talking about that at work and somebody else thought I was talking about Marilyn Manson. They were younger than me. But one of the quotes that's come into my head from that song is, some of them want to use you. Some of them want to be used by you. This kind of goes back to the whole skill or the will concept. If you have the will and you don't want people to use you, these are the things which actually are true, which means your team actually does have the ability to make choices, to make improvements. So maybe your team decides that they want to spend time each week developing those katas as a habit. We've worked with teams where we'd have 2 hours a week. Some teams wanted to have a 2-hour block. They would do it right before lunch or right after lunch on Wednesday. Other teams wanted a half hour every day, Monday through Thursday, right after stand-up. They would work together. So not only does each individual learn how to do things well, but now the team could actually start building up that muscle because it's hard. It's hard enough to do these things on your own. It's harder to do it as a team. They teach us programming in college. A lot of the YouTube videos are based on syntax. But one thing very few of us learn is the interpersonal skills. we don't learn how to work together well as a team. So getting the buy-in and actually working together as a team to build up your strength can have a pretty huge impact. Well, we've seen it. I think a lot of us have seen that work. So as a team, how do we start to do these things? Well, here's a reference from Tim Ottinger, his scatter-gather model. And again, I've got reference to Tim down here. So a lot of people still believe in those Tayloristic ideas, the local optimization. If we can spread everything out, we can join it together. Divide and conquer is a much better approach. And I've lost track of how many times I've seen teams take this approach because it allows for individual work. And that's actually kind of nicer because then I don't have to explain what I'm thinking to somebody. I don't have to deal with their personality. I'll just work on my things. But oftentimes those defects are interjected in it. And if one piece is blown out of the path, then the collective falls apart. So if you see people talking about this divide and conquer, if you find yourself thinking, let's just go ahead and, we'll be more efficient if we divide and conquer, look at it systemically, get some data to help back it up. Pull requests. A lot of fans of PRs here. There's a great idea here that if you have somebody who's going to review all the code, that they're going to stop all the bad things from coming in. But again, that problem is people are focused on something else. So when you ask for that feedback, somebody else is thinking about something different, and they might not really be paying attention to it. There's also some interesting psychology that I've learned with PRs, which, humans, we have more senses in our eyes. So we're really good at looking at things and making connections to that. But when you're reviewing a PR, just like those code smells, you're looking for things and you're seeing problems. What you're not doing, so you see something, you get a quick trigger and you go, oh, I don't like the naming convention. What you're not doing is critically thinking about what problem the person was trying to solve. So you might have an answer, but it might not actually be the answer that the team really needs. Which is why mob programming or ensemble programming can be really helpful. If you get your team together, you can build the PR process into the team because everybody's already reviewed it. We're not trying to optimize for how short of time we can write the code. We're trying to optimize for how much we can, or how quickly and effectively we could take a problem or an opportunity and turn it into some value. If we try to optimize for the time that we're together, that's a local optimization. We're going to have PRs later. We're going to have lunch and learns. We're going to try to teach people what we've learned, or you could just bake all that stuff and right in the bucket together. We've seen a lot of value in a lot of different implementations where getting everybody together, just like you would if there was a major production outage, getting all the ideas in there and thinking through it while you're building it can actually produce much better results. I'm going to skip over some of this, but if you're interested in learning more about mob programming, there's some YouTube videos out there. The Mob Mentality podcast, I know a lot of us have been on that podcast. They do a great job, 40-minute podcast that you can listen to and learn more. And it's a pretty easy thing to get started. So if you're not even thinking about the team and you're looking at your code base and you wonder, it's a huge mess, where do I start? There's some different ways to get empirical data around your code base. So if you find that you need to zero in on the areas that you want to fix, take a look at this, getting some empirical data about refactoring. So you've got churn and complexity. So if the code is very complex, your cyclomatic complexity, if you have a lot of different conditions that a single method or class can have, you're going to have a high level of complexity. If you have a lot of churn, if that file is being touched a lot, that's a very active file. So if I have a file that might not be the most complex file, but it's changing a lot, you might get your biggest bang for the buck just focusing on this one first. And again, sometimes it's better to be able to not focus on the entire problem and be overwhelmed by it, but to be able to pick and choose and say, we're going to work on this validator class. We're going to work on this repo. We're going to work on this controller. And be able to just focus on that, like that previous image had, try to get that cleaned up in a way that we're comfortable with, and then maybe move on to another one. Or maybe an opportunity just presents itself to get this one, because maybe this is going to be the center of a lot of changes for the upcoming features. But if you're curious about getting overwhelmed by it, thinking that we have to fix everything, this might be a good model for you to just share and say, all right, let's just focus on this one thing. Let's reduce the scope and execute on that. I've seen theme of the week work really well as really good too. And this can be where you have a community of practice, you've got a bunch of developers meeting together. Maybe they get overwhelmed with all the things that we could do. Great. Have a theme for a week or a month. Maybe we just say, you know what? If you're in a class and you've got some global variables, just make them parameters. Teach people how to do it. And just for the week, that's the one thing that everybody's going to look at. Maybe for the month. Every time you see global, here's the simple refactoring step to change that into a parameter for your method, and you'll inject it. And then maybe we'll look at extract method. You know, when you have a method that's got 500 lines of code, maybe just go in every if block and extract a method, even if it's got 20 parameters. Just pull it out. And if you start going through these things little by little, you're starting to help everybody else build up that muscle. And again, see the code smell, apply the refactoring. Those little changes start to take off pretty quickly. If you want to get fancy, a lot of people like patterns. You can do that if it's applicable. I would probably recommend that you don't start with the patterns, because that can actually make your code a little bit more complex. You might find that you have a whole lot of extra wiring when maybe you didn't really need to have a strategy pattern. Maybe you don't need factories for everything. Maybe your factories don't need a factory to factory. But if you introduce it, people can look and go, does this fit? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And then obviously decoupling dependencies. I once worked at a company that did auto manufacturing. And I found that they would have to test their applications frequently. Every time somebody would change the oil, the CD player would quit working. And if you got a flat tire, you had to make sure that your headlights would still work. By the way, Paige, make sure your headlights still work after you get that flat tire fixed today. I'm a little bit older, so this might not make as much sense to other people, but when I first got a car, my friends and I loved installing stereos. And we got to the point where we were getting used stereos from pawn shops, and the first thing that we would do is we would wire them up and hook some speakers up to it and see if the stereo even worked. If the stereo didn't work, we weren't going to rip apart the dashboard. So is there a way for us to test the stereo and make sure that the inputs and everything work before you would install it into the car? Once we installed it into the car, we knew the CD player worked. We knew if you pushed the number 3 for 3 seconds, it would set the radio preset. And then every time that we changed the battery, we might make sure that everything still worked, because, you know, the battery was a dependency. It was the power. When we plugged it into the car, we made sure that we got the speakers connected correctly. So front right was good and front left was good. We didn't have steering wheel controls back then for volume, but you know, you could do that now to make sure the steering wheel control works. But it was a good way for me to understand how to write my code. Can I test it independently on its own? And then can we plug it in? And if you start to decouple those dependencies, it does start to reduce the scope of the things that you're facing. Real quick question: for PhillyXP, Are you guys like right at 1 hour, or are you a little flexible?
We usually try to wrap at 5:45.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, another concept for isolation. Sometimes it might be okay to do some ugly things. I was at a client one time and we introduced iframes. And I thought that iframes were the worst thing earlier in my career. I swore to avoid them. But we had a team that had a part in a massive application. So what they did is they spent a bunch of time refactoring, and they basically took all of their functionality and put it inside of an iframe. And they put a bunch of hooks in the code, and then they developed their own pipeline. So that team was able to basically make changes and deploy to production as frequently as they wanted. Sometimes they did it every day, and it was still part of the major monolith, and everything interacted the same, but they were able to test their thing independently. Is it the best technical implementation? Would all architects agree that iframes are great? Maybe not, but it solved a lot more problems than it caused. And that team was able to deliver quickly and get fast feedback. And they were able to take ownership of what they built. As a result, they didn't spend much time with integration testing, and they didn't spend much time with other people's sites not working because their page was broken. It just saved them a lot of time. So sometimes it's okay to not be perfect and just, keep improving in different areas. And James Grenning, I saw this yesterday. He introduced the concept of what do we call it? Lasagna. So change spaghetti code into lasagna, and I loved it. So even if you do have spaghetti code, maybe it's okay to just start chopping it up a little bit, introduce some artificial boundaries, and find some simple ways that you can do it to improve your process. All right, and moving outside of the team a little bit more, I've seen a lot of companies with their CI/CD pipelines become a major tech debt bottleneck. I like to think around, again, some Tayloristic concepts here, organizing around purpose and not function. Anybody want to guess why I got a big old bucket of soap on the screen? Nobody's going to bite.
Fight Club? I don't know.
Fight Club? I like that one better.
That would be a bar of soap, though. That's different.
I've realized that knowing what to organize around can be really, really hard. I've seen a lot of code bases where you have all of your controllers in a folder, all of your views in a folder, all your stored procs in a folder. That's the function, so you organize around that function. And that seems to make sense. A UI team, a backend team, a database team, a DevOps team. You optimize around a given function, which seems to make a lot of sense. With soap, I could very easily look into my house and say, I got kitchen soap and laundry soap and, multiple soaps in the bathroom. I got a lot of soaps in the girls' bathroom. So I could say, okay, well, the function of the soap is to clean. So what if I just had a big tub of soap right in the middle of the house? It'd be cheaper, it'd be effective, and that way we've just got it in one spot, and that way we have it. And it seems like a stupid idea, but I think that that concept has been applied in a lot of different areas where you organize around the function, where the enterprise has a DevOps team, because that makes sense. Instead, you try to kind of organize around like the purpose, the why. That's that concept of cohesion again. All right. And I did not include it here, but I was actually doing a little bit of work around my house last weekend. My wife was gone. Her and my daughter had a dance competition, and I was watching basketball, and then I heard a loud boom. And a couple hours later, I finally went downstairs and found out that my son was playing with one of those little baseball bats you know, the wooden ones, and it slipped out of his hand and it went through the wall. And he was so happy when mom came home because he brought her downstairs and we played a game called Find Where the Hole Was. So he learned drywalling and we textured it and we painted it and you couldn't find where the hole was. But the fun part about that, why it applies here, is I went out into my shop and I didn't have to go around and look at the hammers and the putty and the paint and all those things. I grabbed a drywall toolbox because I made a toolbox for drywall. It's got all the tools I need for drywall. I didn't organize all of my knives in one bucket and have to tell myself I have to go to the knives and I have to go over to the screwdrivers and I have to go over here. I actually built a bucket for drywall and I've got another bucket for plumbing. So when the plumbing, you know, needs to get done, I just grab that bucket and it has all the tools for that. So different example, same concept. Organize the why, that cohesion. All right, so here's the fun part when we start looking at our stakeholders. The Peter Principle, I learned about this early on in my career. Basic concept is people get promoted to their highest level of ineptitude or incompetence. And I used to use that as a weapon where I would say, Mike, he's all Peter Principled, you know, he's an idiot. Not you, Mike, the other Mike. And since then, though, I've actually gotten a lot more empathy around the Peter Principle. I've realized that a lot of people are promoted to positions and they don't have a whole lot of support around them. And with a lot of the different hierarchies, you've got the brown stuff is kind of going downhill. So you've got people in positions that might not have a lot of experience in that position. And they're just basically trying to take care of their Maslow needs of not getting fired. And that's not necessarily something to blame, but it's just an acknowledgement that we have a lot of people who might not know how to lead these teams well. They might not know how to make the best decisions, and they're just trying to survive. So that really opens up a really good opportunity for us to help our leaders that might not be giving us everything that we need. And Jerry Weinberg's quote here, again, it took me a long time to understand it. Consulting may be defined as the art of influencing someone at their request. This does not mean inflicting. It means if you have a relationship and somebody is willing to be influenced, if they're willing to let you help them, then you can consult. So if you're having all these tech debt problems and you're blaming your leadership, maybe you can find a different way to help them out. Maybe you can help visualize the time that's being wasted with this. I didn't build out a full Jira backlog here, but one thing that I found helpful is to break down the different stages that we're working on. If you have to get into a code base that's kind of gnarly, make a prefactoring stage. Put the story in prefactoring. You can call it all part of development. Nobody cares. It's in progress. But this is the time that we're going to clean it up. We're going to make that change easy and then make the easy change. Ani DeFranco, I love her quote here. Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. Learn how to use Jira. If your leaders are looking at Jira, find ways to use that so you can make the change easy and make the easy change. A CFD diagram, cumulative flow diagram. Learn how to read these, learn how to speak to them. If we see that the time to make the change continues to grow, and you can see that the height here is greater over here, right? Each story seems to take longer and longer and longer, and the purple is how much stuff gets done. If you break that down, you might show that in this red area, this is the amount of time that we're prefactoring something, and this is the time that we're actually implementing the change. If you split that up, the data will be generated for you. And you might find if you're working in that same area, the time that you spend prefactoring might start to drop off. And the time that you're making that easy change could probably drop off as well too. Overall, that will give you a higher amount of throughput. And I've done this before, and it's been really fun to see the impact of it. Teams are able to deliver more. Just give them the opportunity or make the opportunity to do the thing that you know you should do instead of trying to just shoehorn more logic into the code that you already have. Mike Bowler, I've got the GitHub reference down here. This was a dump that I made from a client. Took all their stories, dumped it into a CSV, and then I started doing some calculations. I did dev lead time efficiency. So I looked at what columns they had, and I was wondering, for the time it takes to start a story and to complete it, how much time was actually being in development? And by just having these numbers, it was fun for the team to reflect real quick to say, why did we have 100% lead time? Oh, this one was an easy change. We went in, we made the change, we pushed it through. Well, what about this other one? Well, we didn't have design team there, and then we had a PR problem, and then the tests weren't done. And they start talking about like why it took more time. So if we're trying to maximize our ROI on developer spend, wouldn't it make more sense to keep the developers spending their time actually doing development? I like dumping these numbers out because you can start figuring out how much time from backlog to acceptance criteria, how much time from in progress to acceptance criteria, how many days did it take for development? You know, just a bunch of different things that you can play around with in Excel that a lot of leaders know Excel and they might understand that well. So now you don't have to sell your feelings, you're selling the data. Limiting WIP, work in progress. Another Jerry Weinberg's examples here. Every time that we switch context, you lose 20% of time in context switching, and that's cumulative. So if I'm working on 5 different items, 80% of my time is spent switching context. And if you don't believe that, that's fine. Run some experiments, come back here and look at the data. If you don't believe in Little's law and you have to learn it on your own, that's fine. Use the data to prove it. Invest a little bit of time to give people data so they start recognizing that, you know, as you can reduce your WIP, the lead time will decrease and your throughput will increase. It's a law. The more that you do it, the more that you'll see that it comes true. And there's some different options as well too with you know, your throughput and inventory. Same concept, different diagram. You reduce the inventory, increase the throughput. And as I'm talking about data, I do want to make sense or make it known that some evidence is overrated. A lot of people will introduce SonarQube and they think that just by having this data, that's going to give them some good information. It can be. It can also be finicky. If the developers don't believe the reports that SonarQube is generating, they won't trust it at all. So, you know, you got to kind of be smart and take a look at what can we use and how much time do you want to put into making sure that that is the case. Throughput is all that teams really care about, especially management. So if you want to use this to help identify those areas where your team wants to work on, that's cool. If you want to see the trending, the change in the metrics over time, that's going to be a little bit more valuable than the raw values. So if one team has a general uptick in their SonarQube, you might see other values that are starting to trend in the same direction. And basic concepts here is, you know, everybody wants to have a big bang, do a bunch of little bangs instead. Small experiments, get the traction. Don't expect a huge corporate initiative to fix tech debt. Don't set up a sprint to do it. A couple concepts on influencing, you know, recognize who talks to who and find out who can you talk to that believes in you that might have influence with somebody else. If you lack the influence with John over here, but you've got a great relationship with Francis, build it there. You'd be surprised how often the stories can matriculate through. Every now and then I will make up words just to see how long it takes for a senior person to speak to me those terms I made up with confidence. It's a stupid game, but it's fun. You know that the influence works when they're telling you terms that they only could have come from you.
This also works when you live in a country where people are not native English speakers. I've taught a whole bunch of Swedes that the plural of moose is meese with a complete straight face, and they believe it because goose and geese, right? And I taught a whole bunch of others that we call American football hand egg. Fantastic.
I love it. I created these trophies and I really, 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 really wanted to bring them to some meetings, but I didn't have the heart to because I think it would come across as mean. But I do have them on my desk here. And I often think when I'm in a meeting, who had the best ideas and who had the most words in a meeting. And this is something that I struggle with as well as I'm rambling on over time. How to be succinct and tell and share your ideas well. I have found that spending time with other people and talking through things, ranting about it, preaching to the choir has been helpful because it's helped me figure out what is the core path of words to share my idea. And really, do I have a lot of data? Do I have information? I want to go down this path. I think about this diagram so often. And a lot of times the problem with developers is we're thinking in this area. We think about all the connections with all the information. But if we're trying to influence someone, they just want this. This is level one. If they ask questions, I can get into more detail. But I want to give that simple message first and then respond to their need instead of opening up the fire hose. And also not allowing for conspiracy theories. All right, so the proof is in the pudding here. In summary, again, we had those concentric circles. What are the techniques to tackle tech debt today? For yourself, learn the code smells. Understand how to refactor the patterns. Build up that refactoring prowess and develop kata as a habit. For your team, work on all the things that you've been doing for yourself with the team and try to find some ways to isolate. Maybe your team has their own pipeline where you can validate your component works first before going into the massive pipeline, in which case maybe they only need to have a couple of tests and they don't care about every single unit test anymore. And you definitely have to lead by example. Keep learning. And for the company, again, as you can influence beyond there, try to find ways to limit your WIP. It'll increase your throughput and find ways to visualize. Influence succinctly and run those safe experiments. All right, I did have a Mentimeter here, but I'm not going to have time for that. Here are the references that I have made in this talk. And if you would actually like to get a document of the slides, which includes all those references that you can just click, feel free to scan here.
If you want, Dustin, you're also welcome to post a link to your slides as a comment in the meetup afterwards.
Perfect. Make my note here.
Or I can do it for you if you'd prefer.
Either way. All right, so what did I miss? What are some of the things that a lot of you experienced people expected to hear but didn't? What else has worked for you?
You mentioned Michael Feathers in his book. If you're really going to be tackling TechDebt, you need to master characterization testing. And then the other thing that go along with it is mutation testing tools to help you. Actually, my favorite way of characterizing is actually using a code coverage tool that can help me visualize what's covered and what's not.
Mhm.
And a mutation testing tool to also make sure that the things that we think are covered are indeed covered.
Great point, Mike. Thank you.
I'm not trying to be critical, but there were things that I was like, okay, if I was to give him some feedback, these would be the things. I don't know
Yeah.
whether you want this recorded or not. I think it's important that you've got your handle on each slide, but in some cases, the font of Dustin Thostenson and your @ Dustinson is bigger than the content you're sharing.
Okay.
And so I would probably make it a little less conspicuous. On your coupling slide, I like it. I have one similar. I think you're definitely showing high versus low coupling, but I don't feel it shows the cohesion. I can take your word for it, but the actual illustration doesn't give it to me.
I was thinking about that. I'm going to take a look. I've used an IDE example in the past, which was showing the well, at least like the structure organization of views, controllers, models, blah blah blah, versus having person, appointment, whatever. I might have to look for some different examples to stress that, because
Yeah.
I will be giving this at Agile 24, so I definitely want to build it up.
Oh, okay.
Take a look at Jim